of the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel's weekly Q&A. It was a pleasure to have such a great Q&A yesterday. This is the first time we're ever doing it back to back. And I apologize for that. It is my pleasure to welcome you here this week as we have got this day, as we had a really great discussion yesterday. Lots of fun. We do every week at Saturday at 6 Eastern Time, midnight London time, and 1 a.m. in Cairo, discussing different historical topics and things like that. It's an Ask Me Anything, so you can bring up any social studies topic that you would like to discuss, and I would be happy to talk about it with you. We have been doing this for a couple of months now. The channel has been around for more than 6 months, and we are at 4,400 strong and growing. It is a really, really wonderful experience, and I am very, very greatly, deeply appreciative for all the support and good feedback, comments, suggestions, recommendations for videos and topics, and all of that great stuff. So we are live. We will be live for the next hour as I will be taking your questions, comments, topics, anything you want to discuss, social science related, particularly history. I'm here for that purpose. Last week, the Q&A was so good that we decided that people brought up doing it back-to-back days. So for a Labor Day special, I decided to do Saturday and now again on Sunday. And we will be going all the way to 1 p.m. at least. Yesterday went over an hour. We had such great topics. Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming. And thank you for that like. If you enjoy this type of content, you want to learn more about history, and you want to continue to engage and be a friendly neighborhood historian, I would love to welcome you to our club. Be sure to drop a like, subscribe, and get notified. We are, again, doing these live streams every weekend, Saturdays at 6 Eastern, and if today goes well, we might start doing it 2 weeks. Do you remember Blue Skittle from yesterday? Who? Is that a topic? I don't remember that being a particular topic. I did have some topics I wanted to discuss. I got to one of them, the fall of the Roman Empire, discussed how the devaluation of the Roman currency by weak and pathetic rulers helped lead to Rome's ultimate collapse. Yes, I think I do. I might remember that username. That sounds a little bit more accurate. So, anyways, we are live and we are going forward, and I've got some topics I want to talk about. Yes, that user asked a lot about a lot. We talked a lot about World War II, a lot about World War I. We had some interesting discussions about a hypothetical World War III and what that would look like. And I explained how I don't believe that World War I nor World War II are accurate, that there was actually a World War before World War I. And do you think, and so I went into a lot of detail about that. And we've got some good question already. Thank you very much. I love the Romans. Do you think America is at all like Rome? So this is something that a lot of people pointed out. And I talked about this a lot yesterday, how one empire kind of replaces another through human history. And people love to be under a centralized power structure and authority that kind of has international and now intercontinental influence and power and control. Oh, okay. Awesome. Thank you. I'm glad to know that. Anyways, so yes, America is a lot like Rome in that way. And many people see it as an empire, and many people see it as an empire in decline. And talking about inflationary crises that hurt the Roman Empire and really dogged them kind of makes a lot of people think about America right now and its inflationary crisis in the post-COVID world. So a lot of people think that the fall of the Roman Empire is because of weak rulers and because of barbarian invasions. Those were definitely part of it, but they were definitely contributed hugely by the inflationary crises that they were in. America is like Rome in the fact that it started out as a republic, and in many ways, America is still a constitutional republic to this day. The ideas of a Senate, the ideas of two chambers of assembly, all of that comes from the Romans, and a lot of the architecture is from the Romans. A lot of people have tried to imply Illuminati, conspiracy theories, New World Order, things like that, but a lot of America's architecture, particularly in our founding buildings. You go to Washington, D.C., and you look at the Capitol, you look at the White House, you look at their design. They are what are called neoclassical. If you look at the homes of George Washington and Mount Vernon, they are also neoclassical in design, kind of borrowing from the Romans, taking from the Romans and the Greeks. The artwork of that era was very Roman, very Greco-Roman, and there was a lot of influence from Egypt as well. So a lot going on. The American founders were definitely highly influenced by the founding of Egypt. The founding of America was definitely influenced by the ancient Egyptians, but especially the Greeks and Romans. They got a lot of their philosophy from the Greeks. They got a lot of their structure for law and politics from the Romans. So I like to say that the American government and country is founded on two types of governmental systems, the Romans and the Greeks. Let's see, with American influence around the world, they are certainly Yes, it's America is not like an exact empire in the sense that it takes over other countries, invades them, and controls them. But there's what's called hegemonic influence over other countries, and the Americans have definitely had that over Europe since World War II, especially. During the Cold War, America kind of expanded its hegemonic influence with the creation of NATO. It also did a lot of that. Thank you, I appreciate that. Yes, I am not a I am a committed Steelers fan, but I do enjoy and respect the Chiefs a lot. And let's see if they can three-peat. That would be very interesting. Doesn't happen that often in football. Anyways, what was I discussing? So yeah, Rome is a lot like America is a lot like Rome, and unlike Rome, it's not conquering other lands and controlling them, but it is exerting a lot of hegemonic influence, a lot of trade influence, and a lot of influence on nations that it has defeated in war. You look at Germany and you look at Japan; their militaries, their governments, their infrastructure relies a lot on foreign aid from the United States. The United States helps create the United Nations to promote peace throughout the globe. It also helped create NATO to stabilize Western Europe after World War II and also drum up support against the communists. Very fearful that Western Europe would fall under the influence of Stalin and the Soviet Union. The United States propped them up by giving a bunch of aid called the Marshall Plan, and then after the Marshall Plan, created a series of defense and trade alliances, NATO being the most well known of those. And the United States actually, after they defeated Japan, I talked about this yesterday, a little known fact, they occupied the Japanese islands for 8 years and used Japan as their base of operations when they went to war with Korea in the Korean War. So that conflict actually involved a lot of Americans coming from Japan. And until very recently, the United States has made sure that Japan has strict limits on its military capacities. America has military bases in Japan, Korea, and Germany. So countries America fights in, it kind of exerts a lot of influence and control over. Maybe not a direct occupation because Americans believe in this idea of self-democratization and things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of that going on. So is America an empire? In so many ways, yes. Not exactly quite like the Romans. Is it an empire in decline? In some ways, although recent poll that I found very interesting, a majority of both political party voters in this country, in America, believe that the best days of the United States are ahead of them. So is that true? I don't know. But anyways, so if you're liking this content and enjoying what I'm talking about, be sure to like and subscribe, get notified. We do live streams every Saturday at 6 Eastern. We're doing a special back-to-back live stream Q&A. Ask me anything about history, social studies, related topics. It's a great way to grow the channel. I've really enjoyed doing it. I've got such great feedback. But we do that at least once a weekend, every Saturday, 6 p.m. Eastern. We might be adding a Sunday portion as well if this goes really well. What do you have for breakfast? I like breakfast food as a special thing. Like if, of course, a holiday weekend, I'm going to make myself some breakfast and stuff like that. But normally I don't like to eat breakfast. Well, this stream I can definitely talk about the Civil War if you'd like. I've got a few topics I want to go over, but if you want me to talk about the Civil War, if you got anything particular you want to learn about it, be happy to discuss it. The live stream is made for you, not for me. It's a way for me to connect with my community and my audience, grow the channel, and get people's information. But yes, that's what I had for breakfast, and I'd be happy to talk about the Civil War. So anything particular you want to talk about the Civil War, I'm happy to discuss with you. So we talked about the fall of the Romans. I want to talk a little bit about gray or blue. Well, obviously blue, Union. The Civil War, a lot of people think, is based about, a lot of people when they argue that it was a war of aggression and when they try to make apologies for what the South did, and a lot of people and some people in the South unfortunately still do this a lot, they try to make the war not about the big issue. They make it about states' rights, economic rights, social, class divisions, racism or ethnic tensions between different types of white people in the North and the South, different cultures, and the antebellum South versus the industrialized North, everything like that. General Sherman's March to the Sea, I'll definitely talk about that. The Civil War there were those factors, economic factors, states' rights, things like that, all a huge part of the Civil War. However, the Civil War's main cause always will be slavery. The reason the Southern states seceded and formed the Confederacy and went to war with the North was because they were terrified that Lincoln wanted to take away slaves. They actually believed a historical myth that a lot of people have believed about Lincoln. Lincoln did not intend to free the slaves at first. He didn't want slavery to spread to the new Western territories, but he believed that slavery would die out on its own, similar to what the founding fathers had believed 80 years prior, and was willing to let slavery continue in the southern states. He just didn't want it in the Southwest, California, any portion of the West. So the North, well, it was about profits, but I would argue that the Civil War doesn't happen earlier because of cotton profits, because of things like that. And England is actually tempted to legitimize the South and maybe even support them until Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation and reminds everyone this war is about slavery, and Britain, who has gotten rid of its slaves, isn't going to go along with that. So, anyways, what else? I can talk about the March to the Sea. I just did a video on this. It's such a fascinating thing. But basically, the Civil War was caused by slavery. The reason the southern states wanted to secede and they were claiming states' rights was because they were worried their slaves would be taken away. The reason the economies and the cultures and the social classes were so different was because of the large amount of slaves. 40% of Southerners were slaves. That's an atrocious number. 9 million people, far less than the 21 million people in the North, which was growing at a much faster rate, especially with immigrants coming from places like Ireland and Europe. But yeah, the South wanted to keep their slaves and would use any excuse in the book to do so. And the North wanted to bring them back into the Union, and then Lincoln doubles down and makes it about slavery. This encourages a lot of African Americans to join and fight in the Union Army. The Massachusetts 54th is one of the most well-known examples of this. And it also keeps Britain and France from legitimizing the South because they don't want to legitimize slavery. Anyways, so those are a few reasons that the Civil War, a few reasons people give for the Civil War, but they all boil back down to the big issue of slavery, which was obviously taken care of during that war. So somebody asked about Sherman's March to the Sea. Yeah, I do not get the understanding of people in the South demanding this is our culture and we get to keep it. If your culture represents slavery, oppression, secession, and rebellion, change your culture. I understand free expression. I'm not saying anyone should be arrested or Confederate flag should be gotten rid of. I just don't see anything moral about or culturally good about wanting to be represented by the Confederate flag or by Confederate generals or things like that. I'm talking about the American Civil War. I'm glad you brought that up because there's lots of civil wars and they're all over the place. And America is well known for its civil war, but America only had one. France has had so many, it doesn't even know how to count anymore. Germany, even before it was Germany, had civil wars. England has had several civil wars. There have been many civil wars in older countries. Okay, I will talk about that. That's a good question. Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate you being here. If you like this content, be sure to like, subscribe. Really helps the channel out. Yeah, that's true. The South wanted that free labor, but it had actually handicapped them in their progress in the Industrial Revolution. They don't have the ironclad warships. They don't have as many factories. They don't have as many railroads, and that really holds them back in the Civil War. The only reason the Civil War lasts as long as it does and the South gets as close to winning is because they've got the better generals like Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is probably America's best general in history and would be considered one of the best ever if he hadn't supported a losing side that protected slavery. So, but yeah, the South was definitely backwards compared to the North populace-wise, economically. So interestingly enough, despite having all this cheap labor and high cotton profits, the South wasn't economically strong enough to hold on its own. I'm going to go with Star Wars. Welcome from Germany. I'm really glad. I think it's 9 hours ahead, so it's 9 o'clock at night there. Thank you for coming. Not the Civil War, although I was Team Iron Man because Iron Man's one of my favorite superheroes. So somebody asked about the origin of their profile picture. They have a yeah, I definitely didn't say anything like that. I am a history. I have been a history major in the past. I have a master's and bachelor's in history. So I definitely majored in history in the past and continue to major it in an informal way. Chiefs Kingdom. Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, the Don't Tread on Me profile picture. Thank you for reminding me about that. I try to stay out focused. Basically, Don't Tread on Me, I talked about this in a video a couple days ago, is from the American Revolution. and it has been kind of rebranded as a snake, a complete snake ready to bite anyone that treads on it, a rattlesnake in particular, which are known for doing that. However, it was actually originally a cartoon showing the different 13 colonies broken apart, not united and not fighting together, and they were the broken pieces of a snake that were getting treaded on by the British. And the cartoon meant that if the colonies could unite and work together in a united way, they could become states that were united, ergo the United States. So it was actually a cartoon trying to promote patriots, as they were called, to fight in the American Revolution and to band together. United we stand, divided we fall, that kind of thing. Anyways, yeah, I'm going to choose it as my. Yes, that'd be great if you chose it. Being a history major in my college myself, one thing that I found amazing was to try to be a history chameleon. Every topic you learn about in history has equal weight to the topic, and there are connections all over the place. So don't sleep on any particular type of history. Fall in love with the type of history you are learning at a particular moment. Yeah. Any comment on Nat Turner and Slave Rebellion? Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion is probably the most well-known slave rebellion. I believe it happened in Virginia in 1831, and although it wasn't successful, Turner and many of his followers were hanged. Turner was a very good speaker. They called him prophet because he was extremely religious and he was extremely passionate about freeing the slaves. And he realized that wasn't going to happen anytime soon from above, so he determined to free the slaves from below. He was not the first slave to do this in the United States. I just did a video on a man named Gabriel. Gabriel Prosser in 1800 actually did the first slave revolt in the United States, also in Virginia, and that one almost succeeded, if not for bad weather. And somebody leaked that the slaves were rebelling to the governor of Virginia, and he crushed it with the state militia. So these rebellions failed, but they brought attention to how badly slaves were being treated. And the Nat Turner revolt in particular really influenced people to join the abolitionist movement. And it really was a conduit for the abolitionist movement. Men like William Lloyd Garrison and, of course, Frederick Douglass, who really promoted that slavery needed to stop immediately, land needed to be seized from white slave owners, and blacks needed to be educated and given economic opportunities. So, yeah. Definitely Nat Turner's rebellion, not successful, but really got the ball moving in the abolitionist movement, which became really popular in the 1830s because a lot of Americans were in the midst of a religious movement called the Second Great Awakening. During the Second Great Awakening, the Americans really started to not just have a personal relationship with God, but they also saw that as a means for social activism. So a great example of this is the temperance movement, the idea of banning alcohol, and of course, and women's suffrage and abolition kind of all come out of the Second Great Awakening, where people don't only want to believe in their faith, they want to apply their faith to their social situations. So, okay. I'm glad you brought that up because that's such a fascinating story. I love it. I love the Nat Turner Rebellion. Anyways, yes, after the revolution, the snake comes together and represents the colonies that were united. It's a fascinating snake, and actually it brings me into one of the topics I wanted to discuss today, which is how each of the 13 colonies got their start. But let's see if I'm going to bring that up, people bringing up Trump and Harris. People always do one of two things on the live stream. They bring up Israel-Palestine, or they bring up Trump and Harris. So anyways, yeah, okay. Thank you for subscribing. I really appreciate that. And hopefully you can learn something from them. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate your support and everything. Yes, and thank you for tuning in, and not appreciated to everyone who was calling me a racist when I said nothing racist at all. Anyways, so now that the trolls are out of the way, so each of the 13 colonies kind of has their own unique start, and obviously the first one to start was Virginia. In 1607, Jamestown Colony in Virginia. Yeah, I know. They have nothing better to do, so they listen to me. But anyways, so Jamestown Colony was founded in Virginia in 1607. That is the first permanent English settlement, and it was originally discovered in the 1580s by Walter Raleigh, who claimed it for England. And him and a guy named John White set up a colony on an island called Roanoke. And Raleigh decided to name the land that he had discovered Virginia in honor of Queen Elizabeth I of England, who was known as the Virgin Queen. She never got married. So he did this as kind of a way to insult her. So that's where Virginia gets its name. White and Raleigh went back to England, and a few years later, White returned to Roanoke Island, and he found that the colonists he had left behind were gone, deserted. Nobody knew where they went. The only clue that he could find was a tree with the word Croatan in it. And this has sparked many mysteries about what happened to these people, and people have been kind of all over the board. The most common prevailing theories are that they were either killed off by local Indians or they assimilated into different native tribes. Powhatan, the native chieftain who is the father of Pocahontas, later told the Jamestown colonists that his tribe murdered the colonists at Roanoke, although some people believe that they intermarried with other native tribes. Nobody is exactly aware of what happens, but that colony died, and it wasn't until 20 years later that the Virginia Company was founded in London, and they set up a colony. So colonies were either set up by companies, the king would directly own some of the colonies, or groups of people. They had to make an expedition to the New World on behalf of the King of England, and the land had to belong to Great Britain. So that was in 1607. And then in 1620, the Pilgrims, as they're known, the Separatists, who were radical members of the Church of England, who didn't want to stay in the Church of England and didn't want to stay in England, moved to the New World and settled at Plymouth. And they obviously signed the Mayflower Compact, and that's where we get the story of them working with a local native tribe, and particular men like I'm trying to remember his name. Massaquoi was the name of the chieftain, and Squanto. And then they work with them, they help them survive. They're totally dependent on the natives for survival tactics, and they are militarily inferior because they are horribly outnumbered by the natives, as are the people at Jamestown, as are all the early colonists in America. The thing that becomes the great equalizer, tragically, is not war, although that definitely happens. It's disease that kills off a huge amount of natives. So basically let me see here. I'm trying to see if I'm missing anything in the chat. Yeah, so Massachusetts, I don't know where it gets its name. I believe like most states, like Mississippi and Dakota, those are native names. But basically, Plymouth is set up. The Pilgrims have their first Thanksgiving with the natives, which was probably a several days long feast, and they probably did not eat turkey there. But that's what the tradition tells us. It's probably highly exaggerated. And then a bunch of people 10 years later show up who are Puritans, who are not leaving the Church of England, and they set up a much bigger colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony at Boston. So they start in Salem and then they go to Boston, and that's where the city of Boston comes from. So you've got Massachusetts. Then you've got guys from Massachusetts who don't want to be strict Puritans and want more religious freedom, like Roger Williams. He goes and creates an area where he believes there will be religious toleration and also rights for Native Americans, and this becomes Rhode Island. And another group led by Thomas Hooker moves south of Massachusetts to create a Congregationalist movement, an enclave in what is now Connecticut. So far we've got Virginia, named after the Queen Elizabeth, settled by Walter Raleigh at Jamestown. Then we've got Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, founded by the Puritans. Then we have offshoots of the Puritans founding Rhode Island and Connecticut. New York is actually originally founded by the Dutch, who name it New Amsterdam. But they lose a war to the British in the 1660s, and they are given over to the English take over, and they name it after the Duke of York, one of England's biggest cities, York, and that becomes New York. So the Dutch originally controlled New York, and they eventually give it up. I'm trying to think. And part of that land also includes New Jersey. So New Jersey was originally part of New York, and a bunch of Swedish immigrants actually go there and settle there. And eventually the colonies start to break off and become their own thing. The area that is now Vermont and Maine was controlled by Massachusetts. I'm trying to remember exactly how New Hampshire got started, but I believe those were also Puritans looking for a little bit more religious freedom. It gets started around this time. We're talking 1640s, 1650s. In the 1670s and 80s, William Penn, a Quaker, who believes in religious tolerance, ending slavery, and in treating the natives better than the rest of the English colonists do, he's a pacifist like all Quakers. He sets up a colony in south of New York. It is named after him, Pennsylvania. and he sets up a settlement there, the settlement of Brotherly Love, Philadelphia. So that's where we get Philadelphia. So now you've got Pennsylvania, and then in the 1680s, he actually buys a bit of land from the King of England's brother. So King Charles II, his brother James, is the Duke of York, and he owns a little sliver of land near Pennsylvania, and that land is rented out to William Penn, and he starts a colony there that becomes the colony of Delaware. And Delaware is part of Pennsylvania for the next 20 years. In the 1690s, Catholics fleeing persecution from England. Catholics are not very, there are a lot of Catholics in England, but they're heavily persecuted by the Protestants, and they've been at war for 100 years, and they're not really winning. They escape and settle in Maryland. So just as the Puritans and Pilgrims were looking for religious freedom and setting up Massachusetts and places like Connecticut, Catholics come to America and set up Maryland in order to seek religious freedom as well. North and South Carolina are set up in the 1660s. They're named after King Charles, and they are one colony, and then later on they will be broken up into two smaller colonies, North and South Carolina. So at first, the Carolinas are one colony. Delaware is part of Pennsylvania. New Jersey is part of New York. Vermont and Maine is actually controlled by Massachusetts until the end of the American Revolution. And those will become states later on. They're not really part of the 13 colonies. At the same time, in the 1730s, James Oglethorpe, trying to make a debtors colony for people who are in debtors prison who owe money, where they can go as indentured servants and work and pay off a credit, establishes the last colony, and he names it after the King George at that point, and that's where Georgia comes from. So I believe that was all 13 colonies. Am I missing anyone? Yeah, let's see. So I've got snake stuff. Anyways, okay. Okay, let's see. Yeah, upstate New York, I'm trying, I think it's more English settlements. There's obviously a lot of fear of the French during the first century of English settlement because the French are all over Canada and in the central, the Midwest, the Ohio River Valley, and they're going to get beaten during the French and Indian War, and that's how the British are going to lay a strong claim on Canada and the upstate portions of the 13 colonies, because they weren't just the big land they are now. They had to get more and more land, and they did this in two ways. A, pushing out the natives or waiting for them to die, and B, defeating foreign enemies, most notably the French. So the way the Americans get the Ohio River Valley, which is now the Midwest, places like Illinois and Indiana and Michigan, is by defeating the British in the American Revolution. So, anyways, let me see. Is there anything about history? So that's what I've got about upstate New York. No, I'm not missing them. I'm just ignoring them because I'm here to talk about history. Did the French play a role? Yeah, the French had a big role in a lot of that. Okay. Yeah, let's see here. So, any actual questions about history and social sciences that is not just trolling, I am happy to answer and talk about and go over with you. That is what I am here for. That is what we are here for every week with Friendly Neighborhood History. I have no idea what your skin color is, and I really don't care. I'm just here to talk about history. So, anyways. Well, no, I don't agree with that necessarily. Now, I would say that when we talk about history, a lot of people think that history has to be like a century ago or 2 centuries ago or 3 centuries ago, but history is an ongoing thing that is continuing right now. So it's contemporary history, it's modern history. 9/11 is definitely part of American history and is shaping American history even now, even in the most recent political stuff. Was it because of their power? What power do you mean? I'm not sure what power you mean. Yeah, history is a second ago. That's definitely true. History is ongoing and it never really ends, and we are part of it. You are part of it, and I am part of it in our particular capacities. So, yes, it is. So, let's see. 9/11. So, basically, I'll give a little bit of background about it. 9/11 is basically basically happens because partly indirectly, obviously unintentionally, through U.S. intervention. In 1979, the Soviet Union, wanting to prop up a communist government in Afghanistan, invades the country. Now, they should have learned from the British that Afghanistan cannot really be conquered. It can be invaded and controlled, but it can't be held and conquered and subjugated. The people are very tribal. They're very good at using the topography and geography of the country to their advantage and defeating their enemies. The British had learned this the hard way in the 19th century. The Soviets would learn it the hard way in the 1980s. Why am I bringing this all up? Well, there were a bunch of different freedom fighters, many of them on the more radical side of Islam, who were opposed to communism. The Reagan administration in the 1980s, which was also staunchly opposed to communism, decided to prop them up, thinking that if they helped them, they could disable the communists. One of the groups they helped was called the Mujahideen. The leader of the Mujahideen, or one of the leaders, was a man named Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden, as soon as the Soviets were out of the way, started plotting terrorist activities against the United States. And he had no affinity for the United States. He had used the United States, and the United States had used him. And throughout the 1990s, there were a series of different terrorist attacks, and he was definitely high on the hit list for the United States foreign policy. So, anyways, what was I also going to say? Yes, Alexander learned it too. Alexander actually invades Afghanistan, conquers it, but his generals, after he dies, are not able to hold it, and there's actually an empire in Afghanistan during that time that's kind of Greco-Asian, Turkic. It's called the Bactrian Empire. It's really cool. I know that sounds like it's something from Star Trek, but it's actually a true empire. So, yeah, the U.S. definitely uses Afghanistan to fight the Soviets, and then Afghanistan kind of turns a little bit on America. And obviously, the rise of the Taliban, which is kind of protecting terrorism, and the rise of Al-Qaeda poses an international threat. Terrorism, in many of its ways, is not trying to be an existential threat. It is trying to get out a message and to invoke fear and inspire fear. So the 9/11 terrorist attacks were planned by Osama bin Laden ahead of time, and he used 19 hijackers, different men in his terrorist network. Some were from Afghanistan, some were from Saudi Arabia, some were from Egypt, and they perpetrated 4 different plane hijackings on September 11th, 2001. One of the planes was 2 of the planes target the most infamous of the bunch targeted the World Trade Center in Manhattan, and one of the in the most devastating way crashed into the buildings. The buildings caught on fire and collapsed, and thousands of people died. A third plane crashed into the Pentagon, killing I'm not sure the exact numbers. I think a couple of hundred people. And then a 4th plane, Flight 93, was targeted for Washington, D.C., either the White House or the Capitol building. Nobody quite knows exactly. But the hijackers were overtaken by a counter rebellion, a counter hijacking by the people on board, who overthrew them and then took the plane and crashed it into a field in Pennsylvania, sacrificing themselves so that they wouldn't cause any more deaths. But nearly 3,000 people died. It was unforeseen. It surprised the entire world. It put Afghanistan and bin Laden, even though he was actually in Pakistan, on the map. And it brought the U.S. into the Middle East in a way more invasive than either the Russians or the British had been in the past. The United States goes into Afghanistan. I believe it was called Operation Enduring Freedom, and they stay there for 20 years. It is America's longest lasting war, and just recently this week, and this is where a lot of political controversy is happening, America just commemorated the 3-year anniversary of a disastrous pullout in Kabul, which unfortunately left 13 Americans dead. The war was successful at first in pushing out the Taliban government and creating a semi-democratic government in Afghanistan. That was the goal of President George W. Bush. But the Americans were not able to find bin Laden until 2011 under President Obama. And he was actually in Pakistan after many people had thought he had been in Afghanistan all these years. So the war dragged on, and more American soldiers were dying, and of course a lot of Afghanis were dying. And American public opinion turns against the war, and the pullout of the war really takes about a decade between Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden. And so it has been considered in many ways like Vietnam, because guerrilla tactics from the fighters and the radical Muslims in Afghanistan were able to halt American advances, just as the Viet Cong did to the Americans in Vietnam. This this is the epicenter of the war on terror, but President Bush also targets Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, who protects terrorists and is threatening to use chemical weapons on his people, weapons of mass destruction, and this justifies the Bush administration going in and invading Iraq 2 years later and overthrowing Saddam in Operation Iraqi Freedom. That doesn't go anywhere because that war also becomes bogged down for way too long, and it turns out there were no weapons of mass destruction. So that is the begin. So the 9/11 terrorist attacks, even though Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with it, because he was in that region of the world and threatening, just in the same way Osama bin Laden had been, those two areas become targets of American intervention. They try to create democratic governments. The one in Iraq is fledgling and falling apart. The one in Afghanistan is gone because the Taliban was replaced by a democratic government, only to come back to power when the Americans left Afghanistan in 2021. There are actual footages and newsreels of women reporters from the United States the day before the Taliban took over, dressed in civilian clothes, and a few days after the Taliban took over, dressed in the hijab and burqa. The Taliban is a radical Islamic government that is very supportive of terrorist activities, and the repression of the Afghan people has continued. Basically, a bunch of people died, and nothing seems to have changed, except that the United States humiliated itself on the global stage. So, why did the Cold War start? That's a good one. Thank you for the compliments. Let's see here. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that. The support I get is always really wonderful. I think we're still talking about turkey because I described the first Thanksgiving. I want to reiterate, there probably wasn't turkey there. They probably ate fish, maybe duck. People eat duck. There was a bunch of different things that the natives taught them to hunt, and I don't know if turkey was exactly one of them. And again, it was a several-day feast, and they didn't really see it in many ways as a Thanksgiving the way Americans do today. Anyways, what do you think would have happened if they succeeded in destroying the Pentagon? I'm not quite sure. American military would have recovered. The American military is definitely beefed up by the Bush administration and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you have a license documentation to speak? If not, I'm going to have to ask you to say. What do you mean? I have a license? It's called being a historian. Thank you. Welcome to the channel. Yeah, there's a lot of controversy about if bin Laden and his place in Pakistan and what was actually going on, and was he being shielded by the Pakistani government? And it's complicated, and there are answers that no one has and probably will not have for a long time. And there's a lot of tension between Pakistan and India, between Muslims and Hindus in that region of the world. Because originally, historically speaking, there was no Pakistan. I don't mean that in any offensive way, but there also was no India. Though they were part of the Indian subcontinent. And so when the British colonized India, they called it India, and that referred to the regions that had a lot of Sikhs, a lot of Muslims, and a lot of Hindus, and that included modern-day Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. So these regions of the world were not just were together until the British left and decided to separate them based on the majority religion. So in order to keep the Hindus and Muslims from fighting each other, which have been happening for centuries, kind of in a civil war front in India, the British designated Pakistan as the land of the Muslim majority and India as the land of the Hindu majority. Obviously, there are a lot of Hindus in Pakistan, and there are a lot of Muslims in India still. So there's a lot of tension between the two countries. So Pakistan has kind of been, from the war on terror and its problems with India, in the center of a lot of global controversy. Let me see here. The best way to learn a new language, by the way, that's a great question, is to work and talk and acculturate yourself with people who speak the language on a regular basis. I've been reading a lot about this for a long time, and it turns out that children at a young age, if they are exposed to multiple languages, will be much more likely to become bilingual. Can you stream on the 11th as a memorial? Yes, that's a great idea. I think I definitely will do that. That's a week from Wednesday. I think we can pencil that in. Anyways, let's see. Talk about the future. Yeah, I can't talk about the future because the future history shows us one thing and one thing only. The future is uncertain. Talk about your fit. I don't know what that means. Have there been a point in time where Denmark was important? Yes. Denmark has had a lot of importance. A lot of the Vikings come from Denmark, but that's not all that the Danish are known for. Lutheranism during the Protestant Reformation catches hold in Scandinavia because it starts in Denmark. And it starts in Germany and then it spreads to Denmark. And from Denmark, it gets into Sweden and Norway and that region of the world. Denmark has had a very tense and interesting history with Germany in 1848. It was one of many kingdoms that became a constitutional monarchy in the wake of several revolutions. I don't know a huge amount about Denmark. I know there was a very strong Danish resistance during the German occupation. So Denmark, yes, Denmark owns Greenland. So people wonder, was Greenland owned by Canada? Denmark technically owns Greenland. It was Danish explorers and Vikings who settled Iceland and then went to Denmark and then went to Greenland and then probably went to America 400 years before Columbus. Is it true U.S. take Indian land? Do you mean the United States? I'm not sure exactly what you mean. By Indians, you mean Native Americans? Yes, definitely. The United States has a long history of dispossessing and depopulating the Native Americans. Anyways, let's see here. So I don't know a huge amount more about Denmark, but I'm always willing to learn more. People bring up more. Why did Britain invade America? At which point are you talking about? Which war are you referring to? Yeah, there were some, although I like that question about slaves and Indians. Where's there a relation between slaves and Indians? A lot of natives actually owned slaves, both of their own people and African slaves. So there was actually a lot of Indians, Native Americans, who fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Interestingly enough, and there were some efforts, I think, earlier in history with slaves helping natives, both kind of uniting against white enslavers and oppressors and invaders, but not in a systematic way. What would I consider the most important battle of World War One? I think that when I think of World War One, I think of Verdun, I think of the Somme, I think of battles like that. There are several naval battles that are extremely important that are actually more consequential because rather than just the trench warfare where everyone was dying and throwing grenades at each other and getting shot down by machine guns and heavy artillery just to gain a few inches of land, the naval battles were actually much more consequential because in most of them, the Germans, using their U-boats, which were submarines and other things, were trying to break the British naval advantage, and they just couldn't do it. That kept them blockaded. I shouldn't say helped. Led to them starving and basically led to their eventual surrender. I wouldn't say own the land. The Native Americans did not have a concept of private property like the Europeans did. There were a lot of confusions in treaties and agreements between them, between the natives kind of seeing land in more of a communal use as needed. Slash and burn agriculture was big with them. So there's a lot of disconnect because you have people with advanced urbanized civilizations versus people who are more in a hunter-gatherer itinerant stage. So. Why did Britain invade America? I think you're maybe referring to the War of 1812. That is where Britain attacked the United States. The war was basically the United States went to war with England. It's the first time the U.S. actually declared war on another country, and it was to stop the British from taking American sailors and seamen, putting them on their ships, and seizing American cargo. And the British and French have been doing this as long as they've been at war, which have been like 20 years. Washington and the other founders wanted to stay neutral under huge pressure from a really, really aggressive military faction. James Madison went to war. The war was embarrassing. The United States lost huge battles. The British reinvaded America. Most notably, they landed at the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, marched up to Washington, D.C., had dinner in the White House, and then burned it. And so that was a humiliating loss for the United States. And eventually the two sides just kind of agreed to stop fighting. And the reasons for the British taking the American ships dissipated as they had defeated Napoleon. So the United States, in a very young state, quite boldly took on one of the most powerful navies and armies in the world. But it went basically as well as you'd expect for the Americans. anyways, let's see what else. Kansas City not going nowhere. We'll see. We'll absolutely see. I think that they've got a strong core, and they're not that old. So we'll see. I don't think they'll take many steps back. They won 2 in a row. Let's see if they can win 3. I'm not sure. Let's see, anything else. What's going on with New Zealand? I'm not too sure. I don't know much about New Zealand's history, although I know today in history, because I do daily today in history videos, like what happened on this day. The United States signed an agreement, I think in 1950, kind of similar to NATO, with New Zealand and Australia, and kind of sets up diplomatic relations with these countries, which are just getting their independence from the British. Anyways, why did communism fall? So someone was asking about how did the war. Yep, much love. Anyways, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I appreciate any avid listeners. If you're liking this content, if you're enjoying what I'm talking about, like and subscribe. It really does help the channel. Get notified, and we'll see. Maybe we'll be doing 2 live streams a weekend from now on. But anyways, so someone was asking, why did the Cold War happen? And the Cold War is basically, I talked about this at the very beginning of the live stream, but basically after World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union start to peer at each other with very suspicious lenses. And for many Americans, some Americans think that Stalin had been an ally and a helper, but when Americans see that people from Eastern Europe are fleeing the encroaching Soviet army, the Red Army, they start to wonder what's really going on. And there have been reports of Stalin's totalitarianism, his purges, his starvation of the Ukrainian people, called the Holodomor, in which 6 million Ukrainians died in a couple of years. There's rumors of that have been circulating all throughout, and the American government kind of starts to see that Stalin was using them in many ways, and in many ways the United States had used Stalin, but the Americans have been sending aid and relief to the Soviets even before they had joined the war. And so a series of agreements get made up at places like Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam between the Americans, the British, and the Soviets about how are we going to divide the world afterwards. Germany is divided up between the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and Great Britain, and eventually they will leave and set up their own proxy governments, you could say. West Germany becomes a free capitalistic society. East Germany becomes it's called the German Democratic Republic, but it is a communist government with its own secret police force, the Stasi. So basically, the Americans tell Stalin, as he's occupying large countries in Eastern Europe, such as Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, they say, please grant these people free and fair elections and the right to determine their own fate. And Stalin agrees to this because for him, a free and fair election is communism. It's just different communists on the ballot. So these free and fair elections and this miscommunication, although some would say he was just purposefully misleading the United States, lead to communist governments getting set up in Eastern Europe. It leads to Churchill boldly saying in a speech, he's touring the United States giving speeches. He's with Truman at the University of Minnesota. I think it's Truman, the president. And Truman tells him, don't say it. And he says it anyways, that the Iron Curtain has descended across Eastern Europe, and you've got a bunch of communist governments getting set up. The Soviets, the United States is meanwhile giving aid to Western European countries, trying to keep them from having communist revolutions. So the United States is rebuilding Germany, Italy, France. They do offer funds to the Soviets and Eastern Europeans. Stalin says no thanks and sets up the Comecon, his own version of that. So as that's happening, the Americans are sending supplies into Berlin. Berlin is the capital of Germany. Berlin is in the Soviet region that they had occupied. Stalin blockades the roads going into Berlin, and the Americans, not wanting to be outdone, airlift supplies in. And Stalin kind of says, well, if I do this, I'm going to shoot down American planes and we're going to go to war. So he throws up his hands. It's a huge W for the Americans. And it's kind of from that point onward that Truman and the American government look at the communists as always wanting to spread and always spreading perniciously, and they look at communism as a blight more than a competing ideology. So when the communists try revolutions in Greece and Turkey, Truman backs up the non-communist governments. When North Korea, with the help of the newly communist China, invades South Korea, Truman tries to back up South Korea. And like I was saying earlier in the live stream, they use Japan as their base of operations. So that's kind of how the Cold War gets started, and from then on, it's kind of outdoing each other. It's outdoing each other in sports and athletics with the Olympics. It's outdoing each other in technology, the space race. Who could get to the space first? Who could orbit the Earth first? Who could get to the moon first? When the United States finally lands on the moon in 1969, the Soviets say that's no big deal. What really matters is who can get to Mars. They're trying to outdo each other with wealth, with creative, with policy, a- academic competitions, scientific achievements. I was just talking about today. Today is the day when, in 1972, Bobby Fischer became the first American to win an international chess championship against a Soviet, Boris Spassky. It's considered a huge win for the Americans in the Cold War, and the Soviets had plenty of wins of their own. So it basically is a global competition where the two sides don't fight each other directly. And I would argue that it's not Cold War. It's not the first Cold War. There have been other Cold Wars in history. Russia has been involved in a lot of them, and that is kind of how the Cold War gets started. The way it ends, because somebody asked, how does it end? You have the slow but sure and steady decline of the Soviet internal system. You have aggressive anti-communist policies promoted by the United States and Great Britain, and Reagan bumps up American military spending. The Soviets, who are always trying to keep up, it's kind of an economic guns or butter thing. Are you going to have Are you going to have enough weapons? Are you going to have enough food? And the Soviets can't really keep up. Their system is not working well. And under Gorbachev, they have their new leader. They're trying to open up their economy, open up their press, allow criticism of the government. And when Eastern European countries see this, they try to break away from their own communist governments. And the Soviets eventually decide not to stop them. So the Warsaw Pact, which was their equivalent of NATO, which was their alliances in places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, when countries start to leave, the Soviets don't force them to stay like they had in the past. Hungary had a revolution in 56 and Czechoslovakia in 68, and the Soviets had crushed them. They're not doing that anymore under Gorbachev. So basically, communism kind of collapses in on itself, and external pressure from the United States leads to that. And basically, by 1990, the Soviet Union is kind of slowly but surely falling apart. Hardline communists try to take over the government. They fail, and eventually Gorbachev resigns, and the Soviet Union dissolves by the end of 1991. So it's an amazing history, and there's so much I did not talk about, but hopefully that helps. Stalin saved Europe. Stalin saved Europe. That's an interesting perspective. In some ways, I can see where you're coming from, because he obviously is a huge help for the Americans and the Allies in defeating the Germans. They actually get to Berlin and knock the Germans out of the war first. I was talking about today is the anniversary at the start of World War II, and one of the reasons Hitler invades Poland, regardless of what the Allies are going to do, is because he has an agreement with Stalin to carve up Poland. And so 2 weeks after Poland is invaded by the Germans, the Soviets invade Poland as well. So despite the fact that they were ideologically very opposed to each other and really hated each other, Stalin and Hitler used each other before they went to war, before Hitler probably made his biggest blunder, just like Napoleon's biggest blunder, by invading Russia. So anyways, I didn't forget that. That just didn't happen. I'm sorry, I know it might be confusing. I was talking about, some people are asking, so this is my weekly Q&A, ask me anything. People bring up topics they want to talk about. Some people want to talk about the Cold War, and I was just talking about the beginning of it and then the end of it. I don't know. I think that Russia is kind of in a downward spiral where it could have had a lot of help and interconnection with the West, and it seemed like it was going that way in the 90s and especially early 2000s, but it has gone way, way off. So I don't know. A lot of people think there's a Cold War going on right now. Some people will say that. I talked about this yesterday in channel. There seems to be a lot of different competing influences. You have Russia, China, Iran, kind of in some sort of cahoots with each other. You have the United States, Great Britain, Israel. You've got sides lining up, which is a lot more like World War I, where you have only one side has to attack another for all the dominoes to fall, and then you have World War. Than you have in this So it's a little bit more, I'd say, like World War One than than a Cold War, but there's definitely a lot of tension. I don't. I think that they do have an Olympic team, North Korea. Why has religion been so prominent in all of history? Because socially and communally, religion is a binding force. It creates a certain structure because it has a certain level of belief and a certain level of mystery and a certain level of influence. Because people are very, very motivated not just by what will happen to them in this life, but religion seeks to answer the question of what will happen to them after they die. So there's a very, very formative influence on human society that is created by religion. So the Russians suffer immensely in both world wars, just overwhelming casualties. And I was just amazed to find out, researching today about World War One. I mean, the start of World War Two. I did an entire full length video about the start of it, since today's the anniversary, 85 years ago, of when Hitler invaded Poland. Although I would say World War II actually starts in 1937 when the Chinese are attacked by the Japanese. But 6 million Polish citizens die in World War II. The civilians are killed, and Poland is also the epicenter in many ways of the Holocaust. Treblinka and Auschwitz are both in there. You can't force faith. Yeah, that's definitely true. You can't force somebody to believe something. You can influence them to the point, and you can gaslight them to the point where they believe something. And this is true of not just religion, but culture, politics, anything. You can bring the horse to water, but you can't make the horse legitimately drink, even if you're trying to pour water through a funnel into its mouth. Anyways, let's see, what else am I missing? Because I've got some really good comments and questions here. We've kind of picked it up after earlier. Some people were just trolling. Yep, Stalin is basically a big bully, but he's a lot worse than that. I'm good. I don't need a beard. Yep. Are we moving? That's a good question. Are we moving toward World War? I think that if World War happens in 10 years, historians will say, yes, it was obvious that it was going to happen. Historians love to do this. They love the word inevitable. I hate the word inevitable because we don't, a lot of historical events, when you actually look at the specifics of them, yeah, some of them seemed inevitable. But when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot, nobody knew it would cause World War. If you look at World War One and the Civil War in America, both wars, both sides thought the war would be over by the end of the year. Nobody could have foreseen what was going on. I mean, literally in World War One, they're creating new technology like the tank, which the British called it that so that the Germans wouldn't know what it was. They're creating new technology just for the sake of killing each other. Nobody knew that was going to happen. We could be that we are on the brink of another world war. I have talked about on the channel that I think World War One is actually World War Two, making World War Two World War Three, and so this could be World War Four if the dominoes, like I was talking about, fall over. But I'm not completely sure. Are we cooked if World War Three happens? I don't know. I'm not quite sure. Nobody knew what was going to happen on this day in 1939, and yet they made it through that. So I'm not sure. There are ways we could avoid World War. I'm not sure if World War II could have been avoided, especially with Nazi aggression and the Allies just kind of pussyfooting around. But World War One, nobody saw happening like that. And yeah, that's a common historical argument. I'm gonna do a historical myth video on that. A lot of people think World War One causes World War Two. They're definitely connected. You can't have World War Two without World War One. But I would argue as a historian that actually, if you look at Germany in 1926, 27, before the stock market crash in America, which tanks not just the American economy, but the European economy, meaning the world economy, because you have large empires of France and Britain. But if you look at the economies and you look at the societies of the late 20s, the people of Europe are moving towards peace and getting over World War One. It is only the Great Depression that revitalizes the old arguments against World War One, and the Nazis are actually using a tired old argument, as are the communists in Germany, who are being influenced by Stalin. And there is evidence to suggest that Stalin actually hoped that Hitler's plans would succeed so that he could actually foment communist revolution in oppressive fascist states in Eastern Europe. fun tidbit there. But interestingly enough, where was I? I'm sorry. Uh, Basically, World War II doesn't happen because of World War One, but a lot of Germans feel start to believe the Nazis' lies and don't look back at just the past 5 years, but they look at the past 15 years. So it's very true that World War II was not necessarily started by World War One, but they are definitely connected. Anyways, so let's see what else. Sorry, my phone's going off for some reason. Anyways, where was I? Yeah, the interesting thing about nuclear war that I've never quite understood, and obviously this is a huge issue with the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there's nuclear weapons pointed everywhere. They talk about the world being destroyed, and I completely get it, mutually assured destruction. What would happen in the middle of Kansas, or what would happen in the middle of Siberia if there had been nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union? I would also point out that the use of the proliferation of nuclear weapons, especially by the United States and the Soviet Union during the nuclear age, during the Cold War, probably keeps a large land war and world war from happening, because both sides know that if they deploy ground forces, if the Soviets invade Western Europe, or if the United States goes through Alaska and invades either China or the Soviet Union, that they could use nukes and they could kill millions of people. So Dwight Eisenhower uses this as his strategy to keep the United States from joining, keep the United States. He keeps building the military arsenal, believing that that will actually enable the United States to not go to nuclear war. Somebody had a really good question about. Somebody had a really good question about. Thank you for the support. If you've enjoyed this content, like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. Get notified. I've got daily content dropping all the time, longer videos a couple times a week, shorts all the time, and this live stream at least once a week. We'll see. Maybe we'll do it twice a week from now on. I cannot sing the national anthem. I can't sing at all. I can tell you the story of how it was made. That's part of the War of 1812, interestingly enough. But somebody asked who was my favorite president. Obviously, Lincoln is up there for me. Washington sets the standard of what a go, and people don't understand, especially in this culture for some reason. Best is not favorite. If I'm thinking about favorite presidents and I think about personalities, I like guys like William McKinley, who refused to campaign because his wife was sick, so he decided to stay with her. Him and his wife are definitely relationship goals, just like Albert and Victoria of Great Britain, which I wanted to talk about, but I guess I'll have to get to next live stream. James Polk does a lot for America in a very short time and only serves one term. You got to admire a president who's willing to not, do too much. I think Reagan's charm and charisma really, really does make a difference in the Cold War, and his economic policies have mixed results in some ways. They have some really good immediate ones, and some ones that historians are still and economists are still looking at. So those are a few of my favorites. I think that America has had, like any country, a mix. You have good leaders, you have forgettable leaders, and you have bad leaders, and that's just how it goes. Is it often historians use biasness towards writing or interpreting history? Yeah, historians do this. Some of them do it intentionally, some of them do it unintentionally. I'm not going to say I don't do it. I try very, very hard to be as objective as I possibly can. When you ask my opinion, I will give it. I won't get into specific things that I think cause political arguments, because I'm not a politician. I'm not a political channel. I do political analysis videos, and I do offer some political strategy points, but I don't give my opinion. Like, people have been asking me on this stream all day, Kamala or Trump, and I'm just like, no. Somebody told me to say just asteroid at that point, but I'm not going to say that either. So basically, yeah, I think that a lot of people use their bias when they interpret history, and I think it does a disservice to the history. The job of a historian is to tell the truth. We tell the truth. And I hope that what I've told is truthful. I have been corrected many times. I've been fact-checked. I've said plenty of things that are wrong. People have pointed that out to me. A few weeks ago on a live stream, I was talking about the 1936 Munich Olympics, because it was Olympic season. The Berlin Olympics of 1936, I was confused with the 1972 Munich Olympics. So I make mistakes all the time. I learn new things, and people bring up stuff I don't know about. I didn't know about Unit 731, the Japanese team that did scientific experiments on Chinese prisoners of war during World War II. but I learned a lot about that just yesterday. So I'm wrong about a lot of stuff. I'm not right about everything, and I try not to carry my bias. And I would like to believe that many in my profession also do the same thing. I think that that's a good question about what could cause World War III. I think Israel and the Middle East, because if Iran is really committed to attacking Israel to protect Hezbollah, this is just my perspective. I think that that is meant to maybe bait the Americans in. Which, why would you bait in the Americans into a war? Or are they trying to push it to see how far that could get? That is, I think, where the dominoes could fall. I don't think it's going to be Russia and Ukraine. That's been going on a long time. And I don't think China would do a first strike. I think if China would strike, theoretically, they would strike in the midst of a war, not at the beginning. And who knows? China's kind of the unknown quantity. We don't know exactly what they're going to do. We know some of their designs, but not all of them. When's the next stream? Thank you for asking. So it'll be next Saturday. That'd be September 7th, I think. It'll be at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern. I don't know how the Russian-Ukraine war will be stopped. I have read reports that they've tried to stop it before and wanted to go to the negotiating table. A lot of people think that Putin can just be appeased. Learn from history. Today's the anniversary of World War II. World War II could have been maybe avoided, or at least stopped. The Germans could have been stopped before they really got going by not appeasing Hitler and just saying, oh, if he takes this, he'll be okay. Dictators are ambitious. Dictators are expansive. They are not going to stop. Putin has to be put in check some way, shape, or form. Civil War. No, I haven't. I want to see it. I've heard interesting things about that movie, Civil War. Did Barack Obama want socialism? If you study the life of Barack Obama in his early life, he certainly has some affinity for socialism. As president, he definitely governs from the middle, as many Democratic and Republican presidents do. When he was I think he had a kind of a radical phase when he was younger. I don't know about Project Stargate. See, again, somebody brings up something I don't know about. I'm really, really willing to listen and learn. That'd be really cool. Yes, have I heard about the Atlantic slave trade? Talk about it a lot on the channel. Obviously, the third part of the Triangle trade, the Middle Passage that brought millions of Africans to the New World. Many of them, here's a common historical myth for you, many of them do not know that most of the slaves were brought to the Caribbean and South America. 400,000 were brought to the United States. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Yes, I do my best to be as impartial as I possibly can. Yes, the partition of India was based on religion, because you've got Hindus in India and you've got Muslims in Pakistan, stuff like that. Your birthday is on September 16th. Well, we will have to celebrate. I don't think that's a streaming day, but if you come, I will give you a shout out for your birthday. Oh, what was the first World War before World War One? That's a really good question. So the first World War before World War One was, in my opinion at least, was what's called the 7 Years' War. The Americans know it as the French-Indian War. And the reason I consider it a world war is because you have fighting in Europe. Prussia and Great Britain fight with Russia, Austria, and France. They're empires. There's fighting off the coast of Africa. So there's naval fighting. The Europeans have influence in Africa at this time. There's slave trade going on, so there's fighting there. And there is fighting in India between the British and the French, who are trying to compete and pit the different Rajas, Indian rulers, against each other. And there's fighting in the United States that had already been going on, called the French-Indian War, where the French and their Indian allies were united against the British and their American colonists. So you have fighting with 4 different continents involved that lasts for multiple years and reshapes Europe, because this is how the British get Canada. Britain and Prussia surprisingly win. The Russians are about to crush the Prussians and their leader, Frederick the Great. But the Russian Tsarina dies, and her successor is a huge fan of Frederick, and he lets the Germans go. He lets the Prussians go. And so eventually the French and the Austrians surrender. And so that war is a very interesting one, kind of, underrated. So that's why I consider that to be the First World War. Well, if most people want peace, why is there so much war? Because people want peace on their terms. Not everyone's terms, their terms. Stanford prison experiment. No, I haven't heard about that. Is that similar to like the Tuskegee experiment? War of 1812, been talking about that a lot today. That is when Britain attacks the United States. Well, the United States declares war on Britain for seizing their ships, taking their cargo and their crew members, and basically, it's a lot of people consider it the Second American Revolution. If it was, America lost its independence. America does pretty badly in the war, and eventually, the British lose the incentive to fight because they're not fighting Napoleon anymore, and they don't have any reason to continue the conflict. So, and war is very much a racket. It is a lucrative way for powers to compete with each other. So I hope that answers the questions about War of 1812 and what was the First World War. Why did the Germans lose the Battle of the Bulge? One word: Patton. That would have been a. They get trapped in a couple of places trying to encircle the Americans. That was what the Germans loved to do in World War II, with Blitzkrieg and then encircle. But basically, Patton getting there in time really, really changes the game around. So, and basically, by that point, even if the Germans had won the Battle of the Bulge, the war's still kind of on its last legs. They weren't going to be able to hold off the Soviets in the East, and the Americans and the British, and especially moving in two fronts through France and Italy, would have been able to push up into Germany eventually. Why do smart people do stupid things? Because me being intelligent doesn't necessarily mean that I do everything right, and someone being not unintelligent doesn't mean they do everything wrong. So, it took several. Interesting. That's really interesting. I'll have to look more into that. It took several people into the role. Just random people who weren't guilty of crimes or anything. So it was a social experiment on what happens. Yeah, the institutionalization of the penal system is quite something. Yes, they did burn down Washington, D.C. They had dinner in the White House and then burned it. President Madison barely escaped with his wife, who saved the portrait of George Washington. Air power beat Germany. Yeah, that's partly true. Basically, the United States wins World War II not by having better technology than the Germans, but by having more production. The production of America in the 1940s is scary good. Just being able to outpace the Germans, not have better tanks. The Shermans are not better than the Panzers. The Germans are also working on a super weapon. The reason we designed a super weapon, the Americans designed a super weapon, was because of the Germans and fear about that. So, anyways, I think I've answered every single question there, but talked about World War II, talked about a lot today, and we are over an hour and 10 minutes. So I really appreciate everybody coming and staying and supporting. If you were about the pay of pigs, okay, real fast. American did not give the air support to the Cubans that they needed in their revolution, in their counter revolution against Castro's communist revolution. The Cuban revolution counter revolutionaries were crushed. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So thank you for staying overtime. I really appreciate it. If you like the content, well, I appreciate you knowing a lot about World War II. Thank you for keeping me honest and pointing me out. I'm wrong about plenty of things, so be sure to tell me where I've gone wrong. I'm more than willing to hear that. If you like this content, everybody, like and subscribe, notify, tell your friends, family, all that fun stuff. I will be back here Saturday at 6 Eastern, and we will be having daily content as well. Please check out my latest videos, including my day video about World War II. Take care, and I hope you all have a very wonderful Labor Day. Thank you so much. Have a good one. My content's mainly history. Make sure to subscribe. Check it out. Thank you. See you guys. Really appreciate it.